At 9:50 in the morning on October 24th, 1944, the radar room high in the island of the carrier USS Essex lit up with a pale green smear that meant Japanese aircraft were inbound. A second formation appeared behind the first, then a third, stacked from 1,000 feet above the water up to 25,000. Down on the flight deck, plane handlers were already wrestling Helldivers, Avengers, and Hellcats into rows for the morning's second strike. A dark blue fighter sat at the catapult with its fuel lines still attached and 21 small white flags painted under the cockpit rail. Its name was Mincy 3. The loudspeaker cut across the deck. All fighter pilots, man your planes, the second strike is canceled. Then a moment later a correction came that pulled one man out of the launch. All except the air group commander. He is not, repeat not, to go. The handlers began pushing his Hellcat toward the deck-edge elevator to strike it below. The order changed again before the elevator finished dropping. Now hear this. Air Group Commander is to fly. Affirmative, Air Group Commander is to fly. There was no time left to top off the tanks. Commander David McCampbell climbed into a half-full airplane and strapped himself in. If you're enjoying this story so far, don't forget to hit the like button and subscribe. Drop a comment telling me where in the world you're watching from. I love hearing from you. The man in that cockpit was 34 years old, which made him old for a fighter pilot, old enough that the boys he flew with could have been his younger brothers. He had graduated near the bottom of his Naval Academy class. His own Navy had handed him a discharge on the day he earned his commission. And 11 years after that humiliation, he was about to come home to a carrier deck with 2 rounds left in his guns and a single mission record that no American pilot has matched in the 80 years since. The legend that grew up around this morning says he was the worst-rated pilot in the fleet and that he shot down 9 Zeros by himself in one afternoon. The record agrees with part of that. It corrects the rest. And the corrected version is the better story. To understand what those few hours meant, you have to understand where they happened and why the ocean below McCampbell's wings was the most important water in the world that week. It was the 3rd week of October 1944. For days earlier, American troops had waded ashore on the island of Leyte in the central Philippines, opening the campaign to take the islands back. It was the return General MacArthur had promised 2 years before, when the Japanese drove him out, and the men on the Leyte beaches were the down payment on that promise. Around that landing, the largest collection of warships ever assembled was tearing itself apart in what would be remembered as the Battle of Leyte Gulf, a sprawl of separate actions fought across hundreds of miles of sea. The Japanese plan was desperate and clever. Lure the American carriers north with a decoy fleet, then slip heavy surface forces through the islands to fall on the thin-skinned transports unloading the invasion. Everything depended on aircraft, on who controlled the sky over the Gulf. Admiral William Halsey's 3rd Fleet provided the American air power, and at its heart was Task Force 38, the fast carriers. McCampbell's Essex belonged to one piece of that force, Task Group 38. 3, commanded by Rear Admiral Frederick Sherman. Sherman had 4 flat tops under him that morning off the coast of Luzon. The big fleet carriers Essex and Lexington, and the smaller light carriers Princeton and Langley. For days they had been hammering the airfields of Luzon, places with names like Clark and Nichols, trying to grind down the land-based planes before those planes could reach the ships crowded into Leyte Gulf. It was patient, grinding, unglamorous work. It was the whole game. A single bomber that got through to the transports could kill hundreds of men in a few seconds. On the morning of the 24th, the Japanese found the task group first. The raids came off the Luzon fields in waves, and most of Air Group 15 had already been launched at dawn against the Japanese surface fleet spotted in the sea beyond sea to the west. That left Sherman's carriers thin on defenders at the exact moment they needed them most. That dawn strike was no minor errand. It was thrown against the Japanese center force, pushing through the sea beyond sea toward the Gulf. The heavy surface fleet built around the largest battleships ever made, and over the course of the day, the American carrier planes would help send the giant battleship Musashi to the bottom. The price of pressing that attack was a task group left with almost nothing to defend itself. What happened to one of those 4 carriers that day is the reason men like McCampbell were in the air at all. Shortly before 10 o'clock, a lone Japanese dive bomber, a Yokosuka D, for why the Americans called it Judy, broke out of the clouds over the light carrier Princeton and planted a single 550-pound bomb through her flight deck. The bomb punched down through 2 more decks and exploded near a hangar full of fueled and armed aircraft. The fire was instant, and it spread faster than the crew could fight it. Within half an hour, Princeton had lost power and steering and fallen out of formation, a burning hulk on a flat gray sea. The cruiser Birmingham came alongside to help fight the fires and take off the wounded, her decks lined with sailors handling hoses and lines. In the early afternoon, with the flames almost beaten, the bomb stored in Princeton's torpedo stowage went off in one enormous blast. It blew the stern clean off the carrier and swept Birmingham's open decks with a storm of jagged steel. The men standing there to save the other ship were cut down where they stood. By the time it was over, the loss of Princeton had cost something on the order of 347 dead, 552 wounded, and 4 missing, and most of those casualties were not on the carrier at all. They were on the cruiser that tried to save her. Princeton herself could not be salvaged. Late that afternoon, an American destroyer put a torpedo into her forward magazine, and she vanished in a final eruption of smoke and water. She was the first American fleet carrier lost in more than 2 years, and the last the Pacific War would take. That was the price of letting one airplane through. That was what the air defense of the task group was for, and what it cost when it failed. So when the radar on Essex showed a fresh raid boring in from Luzon at 9:50 that morning, the stakes were not abstract. They were burning on the water a few miles away. Now go back to the beginning of the man, because the legend of the worst-rated pilot starts in a place that has nothing to do with flying. David McCampbell was born in January 1910 in Bessemer, Alabama, a mill and mining town outside Birmingham, and his family moved to West Palm Beach, Florida, when he was about 12. He was a big, athletic, restless boy. He went to the Staunton Military Academy in Virginia, spent a year at the Georgia School of Technology, and in 1929 won an appointment to the United States Naval Academy in Annapolis. At Annapolis, he was a star, but not in the classroom. He led the Academy swimming team to national championships in diving and was good enough that he was asked to try out for the United States Olympic team for the 1932 Los Angeles Games. He could not go. His grades were too poor to spare him the time. When he graduated in 1933, he sat in the bottom half of his class. He picked the worst possible year to be a mediocre student in uniform. The country was in the depths of the Great Depression, and the Navy had no money. There were not enough commissions to go around for the Academy's own graduates. McCampbell received his commission as an ensign and an honorable discharge almost in the same breath. The Navy had trained him for 4 years and then told him it could not afford to keep him. He went back to Georgia and took work in construction and at an aircraft assembly plant, a young man with a Naval Academy ring and nowhere to use it. The recall came in June 1934. The Navy found a little money and brought him back on active duty, and he spent the next 3 years aboard the heavy cruiser Portland. He had been fascinated by airplanes since he was 9, when an uncle took him up for a ride in an open-cockpit Curtiss Jenny, and on the Portland, he wrangled a job as an aerial observer with the ship's spotter aircraft. He wanted to fly them himself. Getting there took 4 tries. 4 times he reported for the flight physical, and 4 times he was failed for an eye condition. And only later did it come out that the flight surgeon's eye testing equipment was out of date. A different doctor with proper instruments passed him without trouble. He went to Pensacola for flight training at the end of 1937, the long way around, a grown officer in his late 20s learning to fly alongside men years younger. Here is where the worst-rated story falls apart on contact with the facts. At Pensacola, the place that actually measured whether a man could fly, McCampbell graduated 5th in his class. He pinned on his wings of gold in the spring of 1938 and reported to a fighter squadron, the Red Rippers, aboard the Carrier Ranger. He brought one rare gift with him. Growing up shooting ducks in the marshes of Alabama and Florida had made him a natural marksman, a man who understood instinctively how to lead a moving target and pull the trigger at the right instant, which is most of what aerial gunnery is. In 1940, he finished among the very best in the fleet's gunnery competition, near the top of every pilot in the Navy. The man the legend calls the worst-rated pilot was, by the only test that counted, one of the finest shots in naval aviation. What he was not for a very long time was a fighter pilot in combat. When the new carrier Wasp was commissioned in 1940, McCampbell joined her as a landing signal officer. That was his war for years. He stood on a small platform at the back of the flight deck with a pair of paddles and waved other men's airplanes down onto a pitching deck, a job that demands ice-cold nerves and split-second timing and earns no glory at all. He was good at it. There's a story from the spring of 1942 that tells you the kind of officer he was. Wasp was running Spitfires out to the besieged island of Malta in the Mediterranean. One British pilot dropped his long-range fuel tank by accident an hour after takeoff and could not reach the island, so he turned back to the carrier with no choice but to land or ditch. His Spitfire had no tailhook. The deck was cleared and Wasp turned into the wind at full speed, and McCampbell waved the man down. The pilot came in high and fast again, and McCampbell cut him close to the deck and watched him float halfway down before he touched and stood on his brakes and stopped just short of the bow. When the Englishman climbed out, McCampbell learned he had about 127 hours of flying time total, had never flown a Spitfire before that day, and had never seen a carrier landing in his life. That night in the wardroom, they gave him a set of Navy wings. In September 1942, off Guadalcanal, a Japanese submarine put torpedoes into Wasp and sank her. McCampbell survived, took his survivor's leave, and was sent to Jacksonville to train other landing signal officers. By then he had been out of a fighter cockpit for the better part of 3 years. He was a teacher of a difficult shorebound skill, a lieutenant commander pushing into his mid-30s, the kind of officer a war tends to leave behind a desk. Instead, in August 1943, he was given command of a brand-new fighter squadron, VF-15, and told to build it. It nearly ended before it began, and not because of his pilots. When McCampbell tried to re-qualify in aerial gunnery, the thing he had once been famous for, he could not do it. The standard was a 10% hit rate firing at a sleeve towed behind another airplane. On his best of 2 runs, he scored 8. He had been off the trigger too long. 2 of his lieutenants, George Duncan and John Strain, had decided their new skipper was going to keep his job. So on the next flight, they quietly painted their own bullets the same color as his. When the sleeve came down, McCampbell's score had jumped to 15%. He understood at once what they had done. He did not punish them. He ordered constant gunnery practice for the entire squadron, himself first among them, and he kept ordering it until his men could shoot in their sleep. The ace of aces, the man whose record would stand for generations, came. Within 2 percentage points of being relieved for poor marksmanship, and got his edge back the only way anyone does, by working at it until it hurt. The squadron had a rough berth too. Air Group 15 first deployed aboard the carrier Hornet under a captain known across the Navy as one of its most difficult men. After a string of accidents, he declared the group unready for combat and sent it back for more training. McCampbell was promoted to lead the whole Air Group, the Fabled 15 as it came to be called, and after 6 hard weeks they were transferred to Essex and sent west to the Marshall Islands in the spring of 1944 to be broken in against light targets. He was now responsible for marshalling dozens of fighters and bombers and torpedo planes in coordinated strikes, and his admirals wanted him doing exactly that, not chasing kills. Combat nearly killed him before he ever scored a victory. On only his second mission, a strike against Marcus Island, both McCampbell and his wingman were hit by anti-aircraft fire, and the wingman went down in the sea. McCampbell's belly tank caught fire. He dropped it on a shouted warning from another pilot, then nursed a shot-up Hellcat back to the ship, lowering his landing gear on the emergency system and cranking his tailhook down by hand before he scraped aboard with a damaged flap. It was an ordinary near miss, the kind that killed thousands of men who flew just as well as he did. He happened to live. McCampbell scored his first victory in June 1944 off the Marianas at the age of 34. A zero dove on his division, and he turned into it, fired a short burst from close range, and watched it spin into the sea without burning. A few days later came the great air battle American pilots called the Marianas Turkey Shoot, and McCampbell led reinforcements into a Japanese formation with the advantage of height and speed. He flamed 5 enemy dive bombers in that one fight to become an ace in a single day, then went up again that afternoon and downed 2 more. 7 in one day. He described the first kill as almost an accident of timing. The enemy plane blowing up so close in front of him that he had to haul up over the whole formation, feeling as if every rear gunner in the sky was shooting at him alone. He was no longer a desk officer. He was the leading ace of his air group, and he would stay the leading ace for the rest of the deployment. There was one fight that fall that frightened him, and it belongs here because it cuts against the picture of the untouchable ace. In September 1944, over Cebu in the Philippines, McCampbell tangled with an old Japanese army fighter of the Allies called Leyte. He beat the first one in a series of head-on passes and set it afire. Then, while he waited for his division to form up, a second Leyte bounced him from above, and he never saw it until it was too late to counter. He dropped his belly tank, went to emergency power, and tried to climb after the little fighter, and it simply flew rings around him. He split SE'd into a cloud and lost it and lived. Afterward, he wrote up what he had learned in plain language. The Leyte turned tighter than a Zero. It could outclimb his Hellcat at low speed. He had gotten slow and low against an airplane he did not respect enough, and only its light armament had saved him. Even the best gunner in the Navy could die in one moment of not knowing the enemy in front of him. Which brings the story back to the half-fueled Hellcat on the Essex catapult on the morning of October 24th, and to the 3 pieces of the legend that need testing. The first is the worst-rated pilot, and you've already seen what the record does to it. He finished near the bottom at Annapolis and near the top at Pensacola. And the difference between those 2 numbers is the difference between a man who hated sitting in a classroom and a man who was born to fly and shoot. The rust was real. The incompetence was not. The second piece is the number itself. 9 zeros, the legend says. The truth is more interesting and a little more honest about the fog of air combat. McCampbell was credited with 9 aircraft destroyed on this one mission, and that figure is one of the very few high-scoring claims of the entire war that held up cleanly under post-war examination. Aerial victory counts on every side were notoriously inflated, padded by honest confusion and by the speed of a fight where 2 pilots could fire at the same falling plane and both claim it. McCampbell's 9 is unusual precisely because it was scrutinized and it stood. But they were not all zeros. The common account records 7 zeros and 2 of the Japanese Army's Nakajima-ki, 43 fighters, the type the Allies codenamed Oscar. And even that breakdown carries a footnote, because McCampbell himself, peering through binoculars from above, identified the formation as a mix of several Japanese types, Navy and Army fighters tangled together, and at least one careful history concludes he was probably looking at zeros the whole time and misreading them in the haze. The lesson there is small, but it is the kind of thing this channel cares about. Even a record that survives the fact-checkers carries inside it the ordinary uncertainty of men trying to name fast-moving specks against a cloud. The third piece is the loneliest word in the legend, the one that says he did it alone in a single afternoon. It was late morning into midday, not afternoon, and the fight ran somewhere around 90 minutes from launch to the last pass. And he was not alone. He had a wingman, a junior officer named Roy Rushing. In the same fight, Rushing shot down 6 Japanese aircraft. 2 men, 15 planes. The Medal of Honor citation McCampbell would later receive does not erase Rushing. It uses a careful old phrase, assisted by but 1 plane, which is the official record's way of saying that 1 other American was up there in the thick of it, and that he was very good. The legend tends to forget him. The record does not, and neither should we. If you're hooked on this story, make sure to subscribe and turn on notifications so you never miss an upload. Your support means everything and helps me bring you more emotional stories like this one. So here is how the morning actually unfolded. When a raid showed up on radar, only a handful of Hellcats could be readied fast enough to meet it, 6 besides McCampbell and Rushing. They roared off the deck as Essex turned into the wind in. The Philippine Sea about 150 miles east of Luzon, with the first wave of Japanese already a bare 22 miles out. 1 Hellcat had to turn back almost at once when its supercharger failed to engage. The airplane they flew was the Grumman F6F Hellcat, a big, heavy, rugged fighter built around a 2,000 horsepower Pratt and Whitney radial engine and 650 caliber Browning machine guns spread along its wings. It was not the most nimble thing in the sky, but it was fast, it could soak up punishment that would have torn a lighter plane apart, and it was a steady gun platform, which in the hands of a marksman counted for more than agility. McCampbell's wore the name Mincy 3 in yellow letters along the cowling, with that row of small white victory flags climbing onto the cockpit rail. He had scored most of his kills in airplanes carrying that name. The fighter direction officer aboard Essex, a lieutenant named John Connolly, vectored them up toward the incoming planes through towering walls of cloud. The enemy dots resolved into dive bombers with a heavy escort of fighters above them. McCampbell made a fast decision. He told the other 5 Hellcats to go after the bombers, the planes that could actually hurt the fleet, while he and Rushing climbed to take on the escorting fighters. What he did not know was that the other 5 had fallen behind in the climb. For the heart of what came next, 2 Hellcats were the entire defense of the task group against that formation. The Japanese fighters saw them coming and, instead of diving to attack, turned away, which let McCampbell and Rushing keep climbing until they sat at 30,000 feet with the enemy below them. McCampbell studied the formation through his binoculars and counted around 40 fighters arranged in 3 broad V shapes. The full raid that morning was reckoned at something near 60 aircraft all told. He called for help on the radio. Connolly's answer came back flat and final. There is none. What happened over the next hour and a half was not the dogfight the word ace tend to summon. The 2 Americans dove on the rear of the formation, and McCampbell's 650 caliber guns found the trailing fighter and blew it apart. Rushing flamed another in the same pass. McCampbell came back around on an overhead run and destroyed a second. And then, as the 2 Hellcats zoomed back up for a third pass, McCampbell looked over his shoulder and watched the entire Japanese formation bend to the right and pull itself into a tight defensive circle, each plane covering the tail of the one ahead. It was a maneuver pilots called a Lufbery, and it was a fighting tactic, but it was a defensive one. It said the Japanese had no intention of coming up to fight. They meant to circle and survive and slip back to Luzon. That detail is the real key to the whole morning, and it deserves to be said plainly rather than buried under the drama. By October 1944, Japanese naval and army aviation had been gutted. The superb, deeply experienced pilots who had savaged the American fleet in the first year of the war were mostly dead, many of them lost in that same turkey shoot 4 months earlier where McCampbell had downed 7 in a day. In 2 days that June, American fighters and shipboard guns had destroyed hundreds of Japanese aircraft for almost nothing in return, and the airmen who died were the ones Japan could least afford to lose, the instructors and the veterans who carried the knowledge of how to fight. There was no school left to make more of them at the speed the war demanded. The men sent up from the Luzon fields to find the task force on the 24th were, in large part, hastily trained replacements with orders to reach the American ships, not to win a duel. They flew toward the fleet in formation, and when 2 enemy fighters fell on them from above, they formed a circle and ran rather than turn and fight. None of this takes anything away from McCampbell. He was a master marksman doing extraordinarily difficult flying. But the record asks us to see the whole picture, and the whole picture is a superbly trained American shot meeting an enemy air arm that had been bled white. The legend imagines 1 super pilot against 60 crack zeros. The truth is closer to one of the best gunners in the Navy patiently working over a formation of frightened, undertrained young men who would not climb up to meet him. McCampbell understood it in the moment. He tried 2 head-on passes into the circle that came to nothing, and as the formation finally broke and turned for Luzon, he and Rushing settled into a rhythm. McCampbell would dive from a few hundred feet above, pick a single target with care, fire a short, accurate burst, and pull back up to altitude to set up the next one. He destroyed a third from a distance of about 900 feet. Rushing flamed another. The Japanese held their course and made almost no effort to fire back. At one point, gunfire snapped past McCampbell's own canopy, and he broke off hard, only to see a friendly Hellcat flash by, one of the stragglers who had finally arrived and very nearly shot his own air group commander. A few sharp words on the radio sorted that out. After that, the fight settled into something that was barely a fight at all. McCampbell realized the enemy was not going to engage, that he had time, and that he still had most of his ammunition because he had been so sparing with it. He did a thing that sounds invented, but is in his own account. He turned off his oxygen, lit a cigarette in the cockpit at altitude, and went back to work the way a man works a shooting range. He later called it more a gunnery flight than air combat. He picked his targets, identified each one, lined up the pass, and fired. A 0 went down for his fourth. Rushing scored his third. Rushing kept shooting until, after 3 more passes, he radioed that he was out of ammunition, but he stayed up there with McCampbell anyway, flying cover with empty guns rather than leaving his leader alone. By then, McCampbell had down 7. 2 more careful passes as the surviving Japanese finally neared their bases brought him to 9. Years afterward, asked how he had done it, he gave an answer with no poetry in it. I just kept on shooting. Then the arithmetic of fuel caught up with him. He scanned his gauges and understood, suddenly, how low he was. The 2 Hellcats broke off and turned for home, and when they reached the task group, McCampbell found the Essex deck jammed with airplanes being spotted for the delayed strike. No room to land. He had no fuel to wait. He put down instead on the small carrier Langley, the same task group, and as he rolled forward to clear the arresting wires, his engine quit cold from fuel starvation. The Hellcat had to be pushed off the wire by hand. When the armorers checked his guns, his 650 calibers held 2 rounds between them. He had landed an empty airplane with an empty gun. In one mission, in roughly 90 minutes, McCampbell had been credited with 9 enemy aircraft and Rushing with 6, the most lopsided result 2 American pilots ever produced in a single combat. It pushed McCampbell's personal score to 30 and made him the leading Navy ace in the Pacific, and it was the action that would bring him the Medal of Honor. And the first thing that happened when he got back was not a medal. It was trouble. McCampbell had been ordered by Admiral Sherman not to fly offensive fighter missions at all, on the theory that his real value was in marshaling the air group, and that his hunting for personal kills looked, to some on the staff, like a man chasing glory instead of doing his job. In the chaos of the morning, with the order reversed twice over the loudspeaker, nobody had actually gone to the Admiral and gotten that standing instruction lifted. As far as Sherman was concerned, his air group commander had taken off in defiance of a direct order. In light of 9 victories and a task group still afloat, the Admiral let it go with a single sentence. It's all right this time, but don't let it happen again. There's a piece of myth-correcting buried in that confrontation, too. The picture some on the staff carried was of a glory hound, a senior officer neglecting his real duties to run up a personal score, and the order grounding him from fighter sweeps had grown out of that suspicion. What the record of October 24th shows is closer to the opposite. He took off into a defensive emergency with the deck behind him crowded with bombers it could not launch in time, met a raid 40 fighters strong with 1 wingman beside him, and turned it back before it reached the ships. The kills were not the point of the mission. They were the price of doing it. What the day cost on the other side of the ledger is the part the legend leaves out entirely, and it belongs in any honest telling. While McCampbell was working over that formation, the carrier Princeton in his own task group was already a furnace, and by evening she was on the bottom along with hundreds of men, most of them sailors on the cruiser that came to help her. 2 Hellcats turned back 1 formation of 40-odd planes that morning, and not one of those reached the ships. 1 Judy that nobody caught killed a carrier and gutted a cruiser. Both of those things were true on the same morning in the same patch of sea, and they're the 2 faces of what air defense actually was. It was not a clean contest of heroes. It was a brutal, exhausting, day-long effort to keep airplanes away from ships, and it succeeded most of the time and failed catastrophically when it failed. McCampbell's air group paid its own bill across the 7 months it fought. The Fabled 15 was credited with more than 300 enemy aircraft shot out of the air and hundreds more destroyed on the ground, and its bombers and torpedo planes helped sink an extraordinary haul of Japanese shipping, including the giant battleship Musashi and the carrier Zuikaku, the last of the ships that had launched the attack on Pearl Harbor. 26 of its pilots became aces. 21 of them were killed. A war correspondent who lived aboard Essex for the whole tour wrote afterward that 100 young men had gone out to the Pacific, and that 7 months later, only 45 of them came home unhurt. That sentence belongs next to the record of 300 kills, because both are true, and the second is the cost of the first. David McCampbell finished the war as the United States Navy's all-time leading ace, with 34 confirmed aerial victories, the third highest score of any American pilot in the war and the highest of any American ace who lived to come home. He received the Medal of Honor for his actions in June and October of 1944, the citation reaching back to both the turkey shoot and the morning over Luzon, to that careful phrase about a commander who, assisted by but one plane, broke up a formation before any of its aircraft could reach the fleet. He stayed in the Navy for 2 more decades. He commanded a carrier of his own, served in a string of senior posts, and retired in 1964. He died in 1996 and lies in Arlington. The Navy named a guided missile destroyer for him and gave the ship the motto, "Relentless in Battle," which fit the man. The reason this story is worth telling, beyond the sheer size of the number, is the gap between the legend and the ledger, and how much better the true version is than the myth. The myth is a tall tale about the worst pilot in the fleet who somehow gunned down 9 elite Zeros single-handed in an afternoon. Strip the decoration away, and you find something harder and more human underneath. A man his own Navy could not afford and threw away. A man rejected 4 times for a flaw in a doctor's eye chart. A man who spent the best flying years of his youth waving other men's planes down onto a deck, who came back at 33 so rusty he flunked his own gunnery test, who got his edge back by drilling it into himself and his squadron until it was second nature, and who then, given one chance on one crowded morning, did something with a rifle bolted to an airplane that nobody has done since. The Lufbery circle of green Japanese pilots refusing to climb and fight is the honest center of it, the detail that explains the number without diminishing the man. He was the right marksman in the right cockpit at the moment the enemy's once-feared air arm had been hollowed out, and he made every shot count because he had finally learned, the long and humbling way, exactly how. The single mission record of 9 has stood for 80 years and will almost certainly stand forever, because the kind of war that produced it does not exist anymore. No future pilot will climb to 30,000 feet with a pair of binoculars, count 40 enemy fighters wheeling below him, and have 90 unhurried minutes and a full load of ammunition to work through them one careful pass at a time. The number is frozen in the particular conditions of one morning in 1944, which is the honest way to hold any record. It tells you as much about the war it came out of as about the man who said it. Carry the names. David McCampbell, who was told he was not good enough and proved otherwise on his own schedule. Roy Rushing, who shot down 6 that same morning and stayed in the fight with empty guns rather than leave his leader's wing, and whom the legend keeps forgetting. The men of the Princeton and the men of the Birmingham, who died a few miles away on the very morning the record was being set, killed by the one plane that got through. The 21 pilots of the Fabled 15 who did not come home, and the young Japanese airmen, most of them barely trained and sent up to die, who flew toward the American fleet that morning and would not turn to fight, because by then there was almost no one left who had taught them how. They were all part of the same hour over the same gray sea, and they all earned the truth, told plainly, instead of the legend. The next morning handed the legend its strangest twist, because on October 25th, David McCampbell flew again, and this time he did not fire a shot. The day after the record, his job was the one his admirals had wanted from him all along. The American carriers had finally located Admiral Ozawa's force to the north, off Cape Engaño, and Halsey had swung the bulk of the Third Fleet around to chase it. McCampbell launched to coordinate the strike, orbiting high above the Japanese ships while wave after wave of American attack planes arrived beneath him, and from that perch he directed them onto their targets. He called the dive bombers and torpedo planes down onto a light carrier named Chitos and watched his strike sink her. Then a commander from Lexington named Hugh Winters relieved him on station and took over the handling of some 200 aircraft, and McCampbell turned for home. What he was conducting was an execution, and the condemned had walked there on purpose. Ozawa's 4 carriers were nearly empty. They had sailed from Japan with only about 116 aircraft between them, far below their capacity, and after throwing most of those away in a useless strike the day before, they had fewer than 30 planes left. Their whole reason for being off Cape Engaño was to be seen, to wave their flight decks at Halsey and draw him north and away from the invasion shipping in Leyte Gulf, so that a heavy surface force could fall on the transport from another direction. The bait worked better than the Japanese had any right to expect. By the end of the day, all 4 of Ozawa's carriers were on the bottom. The fighting was so lopsided that historians have argued ever since over whether it should count as a carrier battle at all, since one side could barely put a plane in the air. The man who had set an aerial record one morning spent the next directing the patient, methodical killing of a fleet that could hardly fly. There was no glory in it and no danger to speak of, and it mattered more than the 9 kills did. The bait had a price, and the Americans paid it somewhere else. By chasing Ozawa north with his fast battleships, Halsey left the San Bernardino Strait behind him open, and the powerful Japanese surface force he believed he had broken the day before slipped through it in the dark and fell on a thin screen of escort carriers off Samar at first light. So while McCampbell orbited over a dying Decoy fleet that could not shoot back, other American sailors a few hundred miles to the south were fighting for their lives against battleships and heavy cruisers that should never have reached them. The two halves of the same battle could hardly have been more different. One a slaughter with every gun pointing the same way, the other a desperate stand against odds that should have been hopeless. The record and the catastrophe were written on the same map on the same day. The airplane that made all of it possible deserves its own moment, because the Hellcat story sits underneath McCampbell's like a foundation under a house. The Grumman F6F was built on the hard lessons of the early war. American engineers got their hands on a nearly intact Japanese Zero that had crashed in the Aleutians, took it apart, flew it, and learned exactly where it was strong and where it was not. The Zero was a marvel of agility bought by leaving out everything heavy, including armor and protected fuel tanks. Grumman went the other way. They wrapped the Hellcat's pilot in better than 200 pounds of cockpit armor, gave it self-sealing fuel tanks that could take a hit without turning the airplane into a torch, and accepted that it would never turn as tightly as a Zero in trade for speed, hitting power, and the plane ability to bring its pilot home. The result was a fighter forgiving enough that a young man with 300 hours in his logbook could fly it off a carrier and live through his early mistakes long enough to become dangerous. The numbers the Hellcat ran up over 2 years of war are almost hard to credit. Its pilots were credited with more than 5,000 enemy aircraft shot out of the sky against the loss of roughly 270 of their own in air combat, a ratio close to 19-1, and they accounted for something like 3/4 of every air-to-air victory the Navy claimed in the Pacific. Honest analysts have pointed out the uncomfortable half of that record. A good share of the one-sidedness came late, once the Japanese opposition had thinned into half-trained boys in tired airplanes. The same fact that explained McCampbell's morning over Luzon explained the Hellcat's whole war. It was a superb machine, and it spent its finest years fighting an enemy that was running out of the men who knew how to fight back. The score McCampbell ended with 34 looks modest beside some, and the comparison says something honest about how America fought. 2 American pilots finished above him, both of them Army men flying the twin-boomed P-38 Lightning over the Southwest Pacific. Richard Bong, the ace of aces, was credited with 40, and by his own admission, he was a poor shot who made up for it by flying in so close he could not miss. Tommy McGuire was credited with 38. Both men received the Medal of Honor. Neither lived to wear it long. McGuire was killed in January 1945 over the Philippines, hauling his Lightning into a hard turn at low altitude to save a squadron mate, a maneuver that stalled the airplane and dropped it into the trees. Bong outlived every Japanese pilot who ever fired at him and then died that August back home in California, when the jet he was testing flamed out on takeoff. McCampbell, the marksman who had once nearly been washed out for his shooting, was the only one of the 3 top American aces to grow old. His gift was the hardest kind of aerial gunnery, the deflection shot that leads a plane crossing in front of you and puts the bullets where it will be, and it let him kill in a single pass where another man would have needed 3. No American came anywhere near the totals the German aces posted, men with scores in the hundreds, and the gap had almost nothing to do with skill. The American system rotated its best pilots home. A man who built a record was pulled out of the cockpit and sent back to pour what he knew into the flood of new pilots coming up behind him, while the Luftwaffe flew its experts until nearly all of them were dead. McCampbell's 34 is the product of a combat tour with an end date, of a Navy that treated an experienced aviator as a teacher to be saved rather than a weapon to be burned. The number is small because the men were not thrown away, and the kind of war that produced the number was already ending in the same few days in the same stretch of sea. The Japanese pilots who circled and ran rather than climb to fight two Hellcats on the 24th were the symptom of an air arm that could no longer win a fair contest. The answer Japan reached for showed up the very next morning. Off the island of Samar, while McCampbell was conducting the destruction of Ozawa's carriers to the north, Japanese pilots began deliberately flying their bomb-laden planes into American ships. A small escort carrier named St. Lo took a zero through her flight deck, exploded from within, and sank in half an hour, the first major American warship lost to an organized suicide attack. The men who ordered those attacks said plainly why they had. Conventional bombing and conventional dogfighting had failed to stop the Americans, and crashing the airplane into the target was the only arithmetic left that still worked for them. That is the frame this record belongs in. McCampbell's 9 kills over Luzon and the unhurried killing of a hollow carrier fleet off Cape Engaño were the high-water mark of the carrier war, as it had been fought since 1942, fighter against fighter, dive bomber against flight deck, a contest of training in which the better-prepared side won and the loser flew home to try again the next day. Inside 48 hours, that contest was giving way to something with no craft in it at all. A barely trained young man pointed at a ship and told not to come back. The finest fighter pilot the United States Navy ever produced reached the top of his kind of fighting at the very moment that kind of fighting began to disappear. He had spent 11 years climbing to the summit of that mountain, and he got there just in time to watch the weather turn. Thank you so much for watching until the end. If you love this story, check out the other videos on your screen now. I think you'll really enjoy them. And don't forget to subscribe if you haven't already. See you in the next story.